Hello and welcome to Season 5, Episode 9 of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Christina Hagen, coming to you live from Cape Town. We have over 150 episodes recorded and available on YouTube, so if you miss out because of load shedding or your Tuesday nights have become busy, never fear, you can always catch up later. Now, of course, we're on all major social media channels, and you can use the hashtag Conservation Conversations to let us know what you think of the show, and we value all of your feedback. So we aim to keep these webinars free for all to learn and enjoy. So if you do enjoy the series and can contribute, no matter how small an amount, please do consider donating. As our regular viewers might know, we used to use Quicket as a platform for donations. We've stopped that as Quicket has removed the fundraising feature, but you can now donate directly through the BirdLife South Africa webpage at the link on the screen, or you can scan the QR code with your phone to take you directly there. Otherwise, you can also EFT BirdLife South Africa directly and use the reference webinars and your name, and you'll find our bank details on our website. And we're so grateful to those of you who do continue to support us. So again, we are again running a donation competition with the amazing Ultimate Companion to Birding in Southern Africa as the prize. And we'd like to thank Peter and Irene Ginn very much for donating these amazing books. So if you donate at least 100 Rand, you'll be entered into the draw for one of these books. And each multiple of 100 Rand that you donate gets you another entry. So we'll be running this throughout May, June, and July, and we will announce the winner in August. So if you are able to donate, please do. It contributes immensely to the running of these webinars, and you stand a chance to win an amazing prize. So on to tonight's talk. We are joined by Matthew Zylstra, and he will be talking about why birding benefits us and the planet, in case you needed any more encouragement to go birding. So Matthew is a systems ecologist and an outdoor facilitator, passionate about deepening the human-nature relationship for the health of people and the planet. He has over 20 years of international experience in social ecological research and education. He completed his master's in environmental science and has a PhD in conservation ecology and sustainability education. He is currently the program director for the Kwendalo Institute in Plettenberg Bay, and he's also the research fellow with the Center for Sustainability Transitions at Stellenbosch University and the scientific advisor for Nature Fix, which is based in Australia. And as he told me before the talk, his happy place is exploring the Keerbooms estuary and the coastal rocky shores above and below water, and also enjoys birding as well. So Matthew, we are honored to have you on the show and very much looking forward to your talk. So if you would like to start sharing your screen, and then you can start your talk.
Thanks very much, Christina. Wonderful. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining this evening. I told a friend of mine earlier today that I was presenting tonight, and she roared with laughter. And the reason she did is because when I arrived in South Africa 17 years ago, she was my housemate, and she is super enthusiastic about birding. But back then, birding wasn't much for me. And so it's been a long journey for me to get to where I am with birding, which is an absolute passion of mine now. And it's partly because of her infectious enthusiasm, but also because of what I'm going to share with you tonight, which has had a huge influence on my life. We are talking about Better with Birds and the role of nature connection for people and planet. I'm mindful that parts of this presentation, a lot of it are quite anthropocentric. We are looking about what birds do for us, but I'm sure it's assumed knowledge about the hugely important role they play in our ecosystem. So I just want to make that clear up front. So I'll be going to put my neck out tonight on a few different areas, like this black-crowned night heron, and I hope it gives good food for thought. So as a bit of an overview, I'm just going to put a bit of a context as to why this topic has come up so much for me recently and also more globally. speaking about the benefits of nature contact and health and where birds and birding plays in that, and also the role then of nature connection, where I'll focus most of this presentation, and what that is, how we get to it, and why it matters. This will be the only bird from Australia this evening, I believe, but it's one that I had fond memories also of this person I just spoke. I just mentioned I used to work in this reserve in Australia with her. So the critical issues of our time, probably goes without saying, is the human mental health crisis in particular, but human health in general, and the planetary health crisis. And they've both got one thing in common, and that's the relationship between people and the rest of nature. And obviously I say the rest of nature, us being a part of nature, but it's us and the more than human world, the non-human world. And, you know, some have argued that even if we get all our climate targets right, our biodiversity targets, even our health targets, even if we reach them, if we haven't addressed our relationship with the rest of nature, those targets might be futile. There is a huge issue with it, in our urban areas in particular, as they're becoming epicenters for chronic mental health conditions. And these figures almost become meaningless. You know, we've got an estimated 1 billion people suffering from some form of mental disorder, $1 trillion costs the global economy, 30% of adults reporting that they are distressed or struggling. And in the youth, it's even worse, for up to sort of 50% there. And this is across globally. This was a big study done by Sapien Labs called The State of the Mental Health, the State of the World Mental Health Report, something like that. And the Anglophonic countries are particularly bad. And what I found quite distressing was that South Africa had the lowest mental health quotient. And so mental health is considered to be the #1 disease contributor by 2030. And so within these urban areas, we might be living what Vaughan Wilkins has called this enculturated captivity, these invisible bars of our modern world, which sort of give us a kind of psychosis, the sort of habit patterns that you might see captive animals have. And, you know, the question is, if we are struggling physically and mentally, you know, what is our capacity to care? What is our capacity to really engage in altruistic matters, whether it's ecologically, socially, politically? So we need to find something for this. And just back on South Africa, in this report, it had the lowest mental health quotient, as I mentioned, of 46% out of the 34 countries. And that was a huge sample size. And another way of looking at this is the calls that have been going to the South African Depression and Anxiety Group Helpline. And it's about 3,000 a day, the last I checked, and it's been going up more than during COVID itself. And there's obviously more emails, SMS, WhatsApps that they're receiving, and they can't really cope. And so what are the drivers and trends? Well, the Sapien Labs put forward 4, and that was environmental decline, political instability, income inequality. But the one thing it's been flagging, at least as a correlation across many countries, is the rise in smartphone use and internet and social media. I've also put forward eco-anxiety and climate distress, as that seems to be emerging as another big one. So we have this kind of polycrisis, if you will. The human species isn't doing so well. And yet on the back of all that, we've got biodiversity loss, climate disruption, and this sort of gradual desensitization, disconnection, and degradation of our natural environment. And what makes this particularly kind of wicked is this idea of shifting baselines, that for every generation, this is a term out of fisheries, out of every generation, with every generation, our baseline for what's an acceptable catch, what's an acceptable species count, what's an acceptable connection with nature shifts. And it's usually shifting down. So what we do know, and the research is confirming what we've known for a long time intuitively, and what I'm sure many of you are well aware, is that nature has profound effects on our health and well-being, as well as our social and environmental behaviours. And what you may not be aware of, well, actually, before I get there, I just wanted to say that it's important to put this in an evolutionary context. You know, why it should be obviously very clear to us is that this is where we came from. For over 97% of human history, you know, we lived together as these egalitarian foragers. And actually, we woke up as humans here on this Cape Coast. And, you know, living for that extent of time in nature has a profound influence on our biology, our psychology, our neurophysiology, and also our social and human relations. Humans are remarkably adaptable, but it can come at a cost. And if we condensed human history into a 24-hour day, it would only be, so like basically the start of human history, midnight one day, where we are now, midnight the next day. You know, we woke up as humans on our Cape Coast around about 8 to 10 a.m. in the morning. But, you know, we didn't reach Europe until about 7 p.m. And we only began doing agriculture at 11:30 at night. And then we did, and the major religions came online at around about 11:45 at midnight. So it's this tiny gap. And then it's only the last couple of minutes where we had the Industrial Revolution and where we're living this very sedentary lifestyle. It's also interesting to think, well, what was our relationship with birds for all this time? You know, prior to agriculture, prior to civilization, prior to industrialization. And we know from the hunter-gatherer groups that still exist that birds can be very useful in terms of indicating rich foraging opportunities. They can serve as very useful alarms for predators. They can show where carcasses are, and of course, bird feathers have been used for arrows, you know, for centuries. So all this evidence has shown that contact with nature has important mental health, physical health, and planetary health outcomes. And the evidence is huge on this. It's burgeoning. There are thousands of studies, many of them reviews, systematic reviews, and they cover a range of areas, which I won't go into right here. But, you know, from post-operative recovery to better sleep, to lower diabetes, blood pressure, improved ADHD. And the important thing is it also helps us to care for nature as well. So what's the role of birds in all this? Well, interestingly, there's been a number of studies looking specifically at birds. Now, I mean, it's hard to parse apart the role of nature, but some studies have tried to do this. And here are just a few studies that bird sounds in particular have been shown to contribute to this idea of attention restoration. You know, we suffer from mental fatigue a lot, and listening to bird sound, tuning into bird sound helps actually restore our attention and reduce our stress. And there's different properties of bird sounds, and not all bird sounds are favorable. It appears that in this particular study that corvids weren't always favorable, but I wonder how much of that is enculturation in terms of the negative things around corvids sometimes. But generally, when people were interviewed about their attention restoration, they cited bird sounds as being very important to that. And other studies looking at neighborhood nature and green spaces, they found that vegetation cover and afternoon bird abundances were positively associated with lower prevalence of depression, anxiety, and stress. Another study up in Europe was looking, and this is from German researchers who found that bird species in people's vicinity actually increase life satisfaction as much as income. And a 10% increase in bird species almost equated to the same sort of percentage increase in income in terms of life satisfaction. So people liked having birds and bird sounds in the area. And another report which looked at using this Urban Mind app, they had about 3,000 participants, about 30,000 sort of loggings of people's mood and so forth. And they found that over time, birds and bird sounds were a huge contributor to lasting mental health benefits. Another study was looking at how watching birds near one's home is actually good for mental health, and people who are living in neighborhoods with more birds, shrubs, and trees were less likely to suffer from depression, anxiety, and stress. And again, there was looking at bird abundance, but also actually perceived abundance. It mightn't always be actual abundance, but also what people perceive. And it wasn't just a relationship between the species of birds and mental health, but the number of birds seen from windows, gardens, and in the wider neighborhood. Another a study from Northern Europe found that youth, even if they were aware of it or not, where there was more diversity in bird song, it was actually giving them a greater appreciation of particular urban landscapes. And some of this work has actually informed this book by Joe Harkness called Bird Therapy, which has won some awards. So we know that contact with nature has a range of benefits, but the thing is, it's not just the contact with nature, it's the nature of the contact. And this is this next part of the presentation I'm going to get into here. So it's got to be more than just a walk in the park. Nature has some wonderful ambient ambient benefits for us, even just exposure. But to really get the maximum benefit out of our time in nature, we have to put effort in. So it's about the environment, it's about the exposure, but it's about the effort. And neuroscience has shown this as well, that you put people in any environment, but if they're not putting the effort in, and sometimes they need to be guided to help with the effort in, they're not going to get the quality of the experience. So what do I mean by effort? It's actually the noticing, the appreciating, and the active engagement, and doing this regularly. And this is going to determine the quality of the relationship with the particular space. I like to think of it as like a gym. If a doctor prescribes you to go to a gym, or if someone tells you they're going to the gym, there's an assumption that you're not just going to walk around a treadmill, touch your weight, and move on through and then leave. The assumption is that you're actually going to engage with the equipment. You're going to do a workout, and you might even have a health coach there helping you to do that, to maximize your time. And in some ways, we need to think about nature like that as well. Are we just walking through and shutting off, or are we actively engaging? And how do we then engage with these various elements of nature to maximize our experience? Just as a way to show this, if you look at the typology of nature experience, you could say that it roughly falls into these categories. Nature information, which is much of our sort of knowledge-based communications and education about nature. Nature exposure, so that's like living in a leafy neighborhood, you have coastal views, maybe even virtual nature. And then nature contact, actual sort of outdoor recreation, parks, walks, trails, fishing, boating, bird watching, of course, where you're in nature. But something about human nature connection sits underneath all that, and that's more mindful multisensory awareness. It's appreciation, attention, affect, which is emotions. And that heightens our states of connection. And over time, if that happens enough, it actually develops traits of connection. So a more formal definition of that, which came out of my earlier PhD work, was human nature connection is a state of awareness that's uniting our thoughts, feelings, and direct experiences into traits, which support our everyday actions that respect our interrelatedness with the rest of nature. So what it's doing is it's combining worldview, it's combining somatic, bodily felt experiences and place-based relationships, such that it becomes part of our identity. We see nature as being part of who we are. And that's this sense of this ecocentric belonging. So it's not that we necessarily belong to the motorbike club, but we feel we're actually belonging to this place, to Earth, and so forth. So the nature connection advantage is that it's been shown, and this has been shown now through a series of meta-analysis and systematic reviews, as a robust mediator for happiness. And that's a distinct form of happiness from just contact alone, and a more robust happiness, particular kinds of health and mental well-being, emotional and nervous system regulation. So it actually tends to build mental resilience to stresses, eudaimonic well-being, which is a sense of a worthwhile life, a sense of meaning, and you have eudaimonic well-being and hedonic well-being. So hedonic well-being is just happiness, which is also important, and feeling good, but the eudaimonic well-being is a bit more durable. And then it's been shown to support pro-social and pro-nature behaviours and a care for life. And actually there was a study done by an author called Larson and colleagues who found that bird watching in particular developed a relationship to place, and people were more likely to engage in pro-environmental behaviours when they were bird watchers. So this has been shown not just with bird watching, but across a range of aspects for nature connection. And it's an important leverage point for conservation and sustainability interventions. We're often trying to work out what's going to shift, and it seems that nature connection can be an important element in terms of achieving sustainability development goals. And it's improved by direct contact and mindfulness in nature and just long-term regular interventions. But what these reviews and meta-analysis did find is that it wasn't conventional environmental education. And this is a bit of a concern, because we always say that. We often repeat, well, more education, but the evidence doesn't seem to be there for that. And but we might have to just pass apart what kind of education there, and we can maybe come back to that later. But so individuals with high nature connectedness have more pro-nature behaviours and are significantly healthier than those with low nature connectedness. And that was found over about 830 reviews by this study by Barrick and Jason. So in short, moments matter most. And those moments are more than just a time spent in nature, more than just knowledge about nature, and more than just access to nature. All of those three are important, but there's a different quality to these ones. So it's almost like a continuum, like how we, what kind of spaces are we in, and how we can design for that. The contact, the actual exposure, which is very important, but the actual connection and engagement lead to those sort of outcomes. So there are a number of pathways that have been validated as being able to strengthen our connection with nature. And here are a few of them, which I'll just go through. And the idea being that if we engage with these pathways, we're more likely to enhance our connection with the rest of nature. The big thing, and I'm taking this from the birding perspective as to why birding and bird watching is particularly important for these, for realizing these pathways. For a start, bird watching encourages us to notice. It's very easy to go through a day and not notice nature, particularly in an urban context. But if you're a birder, you're more likely to notice and be aware of birds. And so birding, birders tend to have more visual acuity, more cognitive flexibility, more mental alertness. And I'm just wondering if you know of any seniors in your midst who have incredible mental alertness. And I know of a couple in our local bird club here in Plett who are in their 80s, and I'm incredibly impressed with their photography, with their mental alertness and cognitive flexibility. Interestingly, on senses, what birding also does, say more than plants, is that you've got other senses involved. You've got listening to birdsong, as I've already mentioned. And there was a fascinating study done where they had hikers going through a national park on 2 different trails, and they had a control trail and they had one with ambient conditions, and they played a phantom chorus through speakers with these hikers along the trail, and they interviewed them before and after, and then sort of retrospectively asked which trail they preferred. And there was a significant difference with the trails that had the phantom chorus, more birdsong. And what the authors were saying was it was showing that it was helping with attention restoration and a perceived value and relaxation on those particular trails. The other part of nature connection is it often involves stilling. And as a birder, we're more likely to still. Maybe it's on a stoop watching birds, watching behavior. Maybe it's in a bird hide, which has this lovely kind of sacred space to it sometimes in a bird hide where everything just stills a bit as we're paying attention. And that's really important part of mindfulness. It's a really important part of slowing down and actually enhancing nature connection. The other part of this is a somatic stuff. So we need to move, we need to embody stuff. And what bird watching does is it actually encourages us to get into bird mind, particularly if we're trying to get a sighting. We might have to go quietly, we might have to stealth, we might have to think where might a bird least expect us. And there's even another part of that which you can do with kids, but I also like doing it as an adult, is actually sort of the mimicry of birds. So all that sort of stuff really helps our connection as well. This was one of my own examples that I'm quite proud of. I love snorkeling in the Kerbourne estuary, and a couple of times I've tried to use my stealth mode to get very close to a subject, and I don't have a zoom on an underwater camera, so this was quite a close encounter indeed. And so that's another way of just getting that somatic stuff going. A big part of nature connection is allowing for emotions, and it's been shown time and again that it's also that it's about how we feel. And an interesting study out of the UK looked at birders specifically, 2 groups of birders, one group who was only counting birds and the other group who had to rate each sighting for how much joy it gave them. And both groups had improved well-being, anxiety, and nature connection after the activity. But the highest decreases in anxiety were for those who were actually rating for joy. So, the idea being that if we have a sense of joy as we're also doing our bird watching, we're going to get more mental health benefits from that. Beauty. Bird watching is a wonderful avenue into that. Obviously, it's not hard to appreciate beauty through bird watching, but what you may not be aware of is that beauty is actually being found to be an incredibly important moderator and mediator for pro-environmental behavior and actually a moral elevation. And I refer to a study here from Dissner and Nemec from last year, and it was called "Can Beauty Save the World?" And they had 23 character traits, but beauty really stood out as being the most powerful in actually giving us greater joy and helping us to care for the rest of nature. Then this is an important part of reciprocity, that we're also giving back. And reciprocity has this idea of nurturing empathy and compassion, and we do that through simple acts like habitat creation, conservation activities, caring for our wilder spaces, but also in our urban areas having these bird-friendly gardens, planting bird-friendly species and so forth, and also the use of bird feeders responsibly, of course. Interestingly, with bird feeders, there was a study out a couple of years ago where they were doing, where they're looking at people who are using bird feeders, and adults who were using it definitely showed a greater connection with nature before the use of bird feeders and after, and it was quite significant. But when they also did the same activity with children in classrooms, they found that that connection wasn't increased, and they give some ideas, as to why that might be. But it's just interesting those studies have been done. And then this particular one I think is very important to go into, and I can speak on this with some more authority because it was the heart of my PhD thesis through Stellenbosch, through conservation ecology some years ago. And I was looking at meaningful nature experiences and how that motivates pro-environmental behaviour. And I just think it's really important to note that in all those experiences I documented over 200 through interviews and so forth. Birds came up a lot. And birds give people a sense of meaning through symbolism, metaphor, analogy. Also just through their seasonality, we relate. There's a sense of meaning and excitement when the first migratory bird appears or when the cuckoos are back. We can relate to them when we see nesting behaviour. We have blue cranes here in Plett that always gets excitement each year when they return to nest. So these elements are very important for our eudaimonic well-being. And I mean, historically, birds have been very important. If you go back to the etymology of omen and auspicious, it comes from oionos in the ancient Greek, and it was it referred to a bird of prey or referred to interpreter of omens given by birds. So there's been that kind of relationship. And I've spoken with friends who are ecotherapists and wilderness guides, and they have said, and this was also what I found in my research, was, birds are often revered and embraced as symbols around important life events, births, deaths, transitions. And, we might say, oh, that's phooey, whatever. But whether it's real is actually irrelevant, because what's important is the interpretation, because it's the interpretation that has a causal effect on our behavior, on our emotions, and how we interact with the world. And so it's also very important for our well-being. And I mean, this particular example here is olive woodpecker. And just after our son was born, this was quite a special moment for me. We'd had a couple of rough days. He was losing weight and stuff. And I was at George Hospital in a stairwell, a lot of other people around, and there's olive, a woodpecker there rapping on the window. And just for me in that moment, I mean, my ecologist could say, well, it's seeing its reflection. But there was a part of me that was like, well, it's just a bit odd. We're in the middle of George, nowhere near a forest. This is quite beautiful. And it just, for me, it actually helped me in that time in terms of reframing my emotions during that difficult time. And the other big thing about birding is that one of the big pathways for nature connection is sharing the experiences. And social connection is a huge part of mental health and well-being. And we know from birding and being involved with bird clubs that that's a big part of why we're there. It's a social connection. And what I find particularly amusing is that if you look at many of our birding peculiarities, there's not much more different from the primal way of going out on the hunt, making the list, coming back with our quarry, and then all coming around the fire and singing and celebrating what we've managed to get while we're out on the hunt. So that's actually very important, and it's important that we keep in mind the role of social connection. There is another part which takes us a little bit further, and this is this idea of bird language, which naturalists such as John Young and Andrew Turnbull have inspired me with. And some of you might be already on it with your bird language to a point, or at least you use it in some aspects of your birding, but it can actually go quite deep. And it's this idea that birds have a range of vocalizations and hears possible categories. And by tuning into them, we can actually read a lot of the landscape. It actually can give us a much broader view of what's happening in the landscape. We can detect things we may not have been aware of visually. An alarm call can give us the cue for a raptor. It could give us the cue for a mongoose or a snake. I mean, I had a beautiful example the other day with all the birds alarming, and I was able to locate a puff adder, which was very well camouflaged, but the birds all gave it away. And so this is a very powerful gateway into connection, because it necessarily means we're giving our attention to the landscape and not just focusing on the bird. And I've chosen this photo to show this idea of concentric rings. Whenever there's a disturbance in the landscape, whether it's from us or from an animal, it sends out these invisible concentric rings, and animals pick up on those rings. And, these expert naturalists can tap into that, and they can almost see it radiate out over a landscape, that one bird tells the other bird that instigates something else. And I mean, I don't know if you've ever had the experience of knowing when a hiker or a runner is coming while you're birding. Obviously, the hardy-dars is the giveaway, but other birds can let you know that just by their calls. So there are some pitfalls here, and I will just speak to that briefly. There's this thing called inattention nature blindness, and it comes from, I mean, I've inserted the word nature, but inattention blindness comes from this idea that as Westerners in particular, we're very focused on the focal points of things. And by doing that, we can actually miss a lot of what's going on. Our consciousness can't take in everything in our surrounds. We have to necessarily focus, and we've historically and evolutionarily done that for survival. But we've got the super stimuli now, and it's often in our hands with our smartphones. And so we can actually be very blind to what's happening in the rest of nature. But equally, if we have patterns, particularly for birds, or pattern for something, because the brain's always patterning, we see more what we pattern for. And so therefore, we're always going to be editing out something in our awareness. And it's important to be aware of that. There's also this idea of the gawk, the glance and the gaze. And I might come back to that later if anyone's interested. But there's these modes of awareness that a lot of us, when we're engaging with wildlife, it's often just a gawk. And then sometimes we might take a bit more time to glance and take in more of the landscape. But there's another mode of engaging which is much more akin to nature connection, and that's really stopping and watching behaviors and spending time with the subject, with an animal. The thing here is that we also have focused attention and intermittent attention. And as any tracker will tell you, who tracks in a big 5 area or dangerous area, if you have myopic attention or tunnel vision, it can kill you. So a lot of our attention that we strive for in our society is very focused, and we're often not moving back and taking in wide-angle vision. And if we look at birds, they have to do both. You've got the Cape Robin chat here, focusing for food, for the insect, for the worm, but the other eye is actually scanning for predators, looking at what's happening in the landscape. And as humans, because we're relatively safe, we actually don't tend to step back a lot. And this is also partly why we've got this ecological blindness in terms of understanding some of the threats happening in our world, because we're often so focused on our day-to-day matters that we're not stepping back and looking at bigger indicators for planetary decline. And then the other thing here is our emotional and nervous system regulation. This is a crude sort of summary, but you could say there's broadly 3 aspects. And one is the joy in the pursuit, the dopamine stuff, the go, 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 let's get it. It's kind of the hunter in us, and it feels good, and it's linked to hedonic well-being, and it gives us a kick. The other part of our life is the threat and the anxiety, the avoidance, which tends to stimulate our adrenaline and cortisol and so forth. And most of our modern day life is between those 2 aspects. And we don't really give enough attention to slowing down, to rest and digest, to contentment, which tends to release the opiates and the oxytocin and so forth. And it's interesting because as birders, a lot of what we do is this idea of the pursuit, and which is fantastic. And that's that's a great kick, and I don't want to be burnt at the stake here, of course, but we just need to be aware that we have to also, for our emotional nervous system regulation, to slow down and also engage in the slower stuff. And that comes through in our language as well. We speak about go birding, we speak about twitching, we speak about being a lister, and all those terms imply this kind of pursuit. Whereas if you said, get to know our feathered friends, it's a very different kind of language, and it might seem semantics and it might seem silly, but there's actually been studies showing that using a sort of less a dominionistic language can enhance our nature connection. So a summary there is that nature needs our attention. And I don't mean in the usual sense of save the planet, but actually in order for us to receive the benefits from nature, in order for nature, I think, to activate through our perception, is by actually ensuring that moment to moment and everyday awareness is being cued in towards nature. It's the everyday noticing which is most important, the at the moment to moment. And, our experiences form our consciousness, and without an ecological consciousness, we can't have an ecological conscience. That's why this is so important. So what are some applications of that? With my work in Australia, we've actually developed these self-guided wellness trails, which is an app-supported program which uses your geolocation and audio, so you can listen in for guided nature connection activities. And we've got a whole lot of evidence-led exercises on that, and that's for using the science to look at what kind of activities will actually enhance our well-being, improve our mood, reduce stress, and so forth. And some of those activities are bird-specific. And what I really wanted to get to here is that we've partnered with a range of organisations there, from hospitals to university campuses, parks and botanical gardens. But we've also partnered with BirdLife Australia. And we've actually got a Better with Birds trail, where there's a number of stations or stops where you can listen to the app. And these are more bird-specific routines. And as Dr. Holly Parsons from BirdLife Australia said, is that this is a guided experience that takes you through just the appreciation and the wonderful life of birds. So it's not about learning about birds per se, but just actually connecting more deeply through your senses. And this was not with BirdLife Australia, this was the Forestry Corporation in Australia, but we actually developed a listening pod on one of the trails where you can crawl into there, and it enhances the sounds of the forest. And so particularly that's powerful for tuning into the birds. Back here in South Africa, the work I do with the Kwendalo Institute, we're currently working with a number of local GPs and healthcare professionals to empower them to feel that they can prescribe nature as part of a preventative and a treatment intervention. And what a nature referral is, or a nature prescription, is it's this complementary nature-based intervention that they can formally recommend to a patient or a client. And so you're linking people from primary care or social care or other referral routes to nature-based activities. And this is done to promote a range of health outcomes for optimal well-being, as I've already spoken. So it's sort of linking your natural settings, meaningful activities, and community context to have this sort of health ecosystem, which is far more nature-minded. And the meta-analysis and reviews on nature prescriptions, because it's already being piloted around the world in various places, shows that these kind of prescriptions help cardiometabolic health, mental health, increase physical activity, and pro-nature behaviours. There was a study done, which was popularised in The Guardian, where they were looking about how bird encounters improve mental health. And what they were suggesting is that as medical professionals should actually be prescribing bird watching to improve mental well-being. So that's the sort of space that we're working in, and we're hoping that we can also find similar ways to encourage more bird watching for mental health and well-being. And what you're doing here is you're connecting your prescribing model, your healthcare sector, with, say, with nature guides and outdoor facilitators, and you're with the prescribing, you're encouraging your healthcare professionals to encourage more meaningful nature moments into people's everyday lifestyle. The programming is saying, well, how do we engage people in nature connection activities such as birding as a preventative or as a treatment to health challenges? And then this idea of placing is like, you're either working with your existing urban landscapes or designing spaces that afford more opportunities for engaging with nature meaningfully and cultivating a sense of place. So that's what we're looking at the moment, as to how to bridge that gap and seeing the role that the birding and bird watching can provide. And we're doing that at Kwendalo, and we work with BirdLife Plettenberg Bay as a partner who co-funded a bird hide at Kwendalo, which is a wellness farm. And we're hoping that the access to the bird hide and the use of the bird hide can also help people's appreciation of birds and their mental and physical health as well. So thanks very much, and yeah, happy for any questions if you have any.
Wow, thanks so much, Matthew. That was an amazing presentation, and it resonated. A lot of what you said resonated with me. So yeah, thanks very much for sharing your knowledge and your learnings with us. I can definitely attest to the kind of mental benefits of going birding. As a relatively new birder myself, I've definitely found that days when I go birding, I'm in a much better mental space than when I don't. So I can definitely personally attest to that. Before we get on to questions, I see there's only one so far. So if anyone does have any questions for Matthew, please put them in the Q&A box rather than in the chat feed. But I just want to remind everyone that we will be back in 2 weeks' time, and we will have a talk by Richard Dixon, who is with BirdLife International, and he'll be sharing some information from the work that is being done in the Gola Forest in Sierra Leone. So it promises to be a very interesting webinar as well. And I also just wanted to remind members of BirdLife, that we are having our AGM on Saturday the 18th. And so please do either join us in person if you happen to be in Durban, or join us online via Zoom, and you can find all those details on our website. Okay, so we'll just get to some questions, Matthew. So there's one from Shashi saying, and I think you touched on this a little bit in your talk, but maybe you can expand, saying birding could be used as mental therapy akin to encounters with dolphins, and asking if there are any studies related to this. So you alluded to that one that was in The Guardian. I don't know if you have anything to kind of expand on that.
Yes. I mean, there's certainly a number of studies now just showing the therapeutic benefits of birding and bird watching, and I think it's a really big avenue for birding in general. And we often think of AV tourism and the tourism and recreation, and that has a lot of benefits. But for me, this is still unexplored, and it's low hanging fruit. And what the studies also point out is that it can actually be more accessible than, I mean, you give the example of dolphin watching. I mean, that's obviously very costly and not accessible on an everyday basis. So it could be this wow bang intervention, but for strengthening connection with nature and sense of place, it's the everyday things that's important. And compared to a lot of green space interventions and nature and health interventions, birding is one of the most accessible. Birds are everywhere, and their appreciation can happen almost everywhere. So yeah, I mean, I didn't go into this talk in terms of the barriers of nature connection. In particular, there are distinct barriers in South Africa, which I can come to if people are interested, of course. I mean, access is a big one. Feeling comfortable in spaces, transport, social factors. I mean, there's a lot that I'd go into. But birding can transcend a lot of that. You don't need a big lens and binoculars to gain appreciation.
Yeah, absolutely. So linked to that, Michaela Stockberg has just put a question in the Q&A saying, thanks for the great presentation. I'm not sure if you've heard about the luxury effect, which explains the pattern of increased bird diversity with income. Given the benefits of birding, how can one derive these benefits in communities where bird opportunities are lower? How can we make the experience richer in less diverse spaces? So that's such an important point in South Africa, especially.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I mean, it's not I guess a 30-second answer, but I would just come back to the pathways that I alluded to. And yes, the thing is, ambient effects. So bird diversity is fantastic for the ambient effects and for the exposure when you're not necessarily aware. Like some of those studies were showing that people weren't necessarily trying to engage, but they were just aware there was bird song. And yeah, I mean, that is a luxury effect to have that bird diversity there. But when you actively engage, when you encourage to put in the effort, and this can happen through education programs, and which are not just knowledge based but are far more experiential, then even with a lower diversity of birds, you can still get that, just the appreciation of being able to spend time with the bird for a bit, maybe trying to draw it, maybe mimicking its behavior. maybe just, I mean, there's a whole range of activities you can do, in which we've done. So yeah, I mean, that's one thing. The other thing is that, you know, birds do, like I think of the Cape Flats and some of the areas which are good bird watching areas. You know, I mean, you can find them at sewage works. You can find them in areas where you don't always expect, and it can be more accessible. I mean, around a Sekufle is a wonderful example of that as well. So
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks. And I think that, yeah, does need to be emphasized, is that you can find birds everywhere, and that connection with them, as you say, is the important thing. So linked to that.
But I just want to also just add to that. I mean, really, I mean, it isn't hard also. I mean, we can do more to be greening our urban spaces and making them more bird friendly. And this is a really important thing there, that the urban diversity is critical in having those corridors. Yeah.
Absolutely. So linked to that, and it was something that popped into my mind as you kind of said, the conventional environmental education systems weren't necessarily achieving the outcomes that we might expect. So George Ledek says, how do you think that environmental education could be improved to maximize attitudes of caring for nature, and I guess the connection to nature?
Yeah, I mean, again, I sort of come back to those pathways. I think by incorporating many of those pathways into education programs, it's going to be far more likely to hit the target. I just think, particularly for learners, and I mean, I guess we often think of learners as being under 10, but it goes beyond that. But I would say just taking the foot off the pedal a bit in terms of knowledge that's too abstract, you know, sort of going too much to, say, you know, climate crisis or biodiversity crisis, and understanding what's actually relevant to those learners in their particular place. You know, and this is the importance of place-based education, really knowing what's relevant, what are the birds in one's area that they can know. And it doesn't have to be knowing the names. What I'm having fun doing with my son is asking him to give the bird a name. And it's wonderful, because it's actually far more meaningful for him. I can tell him that people call it the red-knobbed coot, but at the moment, the red-knobbed coot for him is the ambulance bird, because it's got two little red sirens on his head. And I mean, that's wonderful, you know. And so he remembers it as the ambulance bird. And at this point in time, it doesn't really matter. So there are just different ways of engaging. As I said, I mean, you can there's many different bird games you can play in terms of mimicry. I mean, putting bird feeders into a schoolyard is a wonderful way, creating bird-friendly habitat, so you're understanding the connections between your birds and their preferences for their habitat. Working with the calls and actually igniting that sense, not just the visually, but playing the calls. And so, yeah, there isn't one size fits all. It's contextual. It depends on the space and the learners. But there's just that's just some ideas there, yeah. And you're really just trying to inculcate care, because it's the connection that leads to the care that changes the attitudes and behaviors.
Yeah, great. I love the ambulance bird. I'm going to think of that every time I see a coot now. So we have a question from Aldo Baruti. First, he says, brilliant talk, Matthew. And then, how do you see the use of AI binoculars, and how will this kind of delete the engagement part of birding? And I know these are quite a new and controversial technological innovation. Do you have any thoughts?
I'm a little bit, I have to admit, my bias is against tech, because it often doesn't end well. But I have to always come back to that in my bias. Okay, let's look at evidence. It might be an entry point in. I think it could be a useful entry point for people to go in and go. Like, there's a novelty factor. Humans need novelty; they thrive in it. There's a novelty factor, but I do think there's a threshold point where it becomes the so what factor. And I've done a lot of outdoor lecturing over the years, and I used to have North American undergrad students, and we had an outdoor program here in South Africa, and they would just want to know the name of the bird, the name of the plant. And it would be like, oh, well, I can tell you, but so what? And I think that's for me, because what was more interesting for them, particularly going back to the US, was, well, what bird does it remind you of in the US? How would you identify it when you're back home? What does it remind you of? Let's try and get into its world. What's it doing right now? Is it in baseline behavior? Is it alarming? I think there's so much more there that AI binoculars may or may not reach. And I think that's for me where if it can stimulate further curiosity and finding out, great. But I have a sense is that there's the thing about humans that we like, now I've heard it, it's enough. You know, I know about the climate, or I know about biodiversity loss, so I'm all over it. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we do anything. So that would be my concern with the AI binoculars, is that it just becomes, oh yeah, it's that. And at least, you know, they make mistakes, presumably in the beginning. And, you know, I think it's good to have a backup, like, well, it says it's that, but I'm pretty sure, you know, it's not. And I think that's another one.
Yeah, great. I think I would.
And also, just last thing, we're always mediating our experience. There's so much that mediates our experience these days. It's a screen, it's a binoculars, it's a camera, which per se is not wrong. But again, how much, you know, and it's just nice to, let's just have direct experience.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Leslie Cornish asks, when people become avid bird listers, can the effect be negative? And they say, I have met some pretty unhappy and stressed listers, especially when they miss the targeted bird. And I can sometimes be a bit of a lister myself, but I try and sort of control those edges and sometimes just go out birding just for the fun and enjoyment rather than keeping a list. Do you have any thoughts on that type of birding?
Yeah, I gave a short talk a while ago to the local BirdLife club, like only 5-10 minute introduction when we introduced the bird hide. And someone came up to me quite aggrieved afterwards and says, birding does not make me happy. No, that wasn't it. I find it stressful. I find it very stressful. And, you know, I think if you just inquire there, when we do put too much focus on the hunt, and I showed that little emotional nervous system regulation, so it's possibly a bit out of balance. I mean, I'm a lister now. I don't drop what I'm doing and run and chase a report, but I'm growing up my list in my various areas, and I enjoy it. It really gives, like, it's motivating. It urges me to get out. It's fantastic, and that's part of our hedonic well-being. It's important. But yes, if you're overbalancing it and it becomes the be all and end all, and you forget to actually just say, can I just stop and appreciate it? Just watch that bird that's pretty common. Can I just watch it doing its thing, you know, and just and be with it and learn something about it? Then yeah, I think that balances it up, and that's that rest and digest component that I was speaking of. Yeah.
Yeah, and I saw somewhere in the chat, someone said, you know, the difference between looking for the bird and actually seeing the bird is like, you can, you know, look at it but not actually see it.
Yeah, and there's also fun in the hunt as well. Yeah, but I mean, I think I understand what you're saying there, that the comment is that, yeah, you've looked at it, you've checked it, and then you've gone, and you didn't really see it. And there's a part of this this is where about relationship. And in general, when I speak about nature connection, I often urge people to think about visiting their grandmother, if she's still alive, or think back when she was alive, and that sort of relationship. Do you just pop in and say, you know, here's the cookies, I'm off, I've seen you? Do you sit down and do all the talking and never shut up? You know, there's a part of that relationality where you sit with your elder and you just be there and you listen and you notice. And I think if we started to think about nature more like that, it would actually help us, because there's a real relationship happening there, which is quite different. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that analogy. So 2 questions that are quite similar, one from Mervyn Wetmore and one from Lynn Jackson, asking about the medical professions and the doctors, whether they are kind of receptive to the idea of, you know, taking up the nature connection idea and prescribing these nature activities or birding or whatever it is.
Yeah, it's hard to generalize. I've had some very positive feedback personally. I've had some more reticent feedback. I heard via someone who had contacts with medical aid that they were like, what? What are you talking about? Why would we think about that? But generally, my experience is when you can show the evidence, and I showed very little tonight, around nature prescriptions. I gave a whole day workshop last year, which included a number of healthcare professionals where we really went through the evidence. Then it's like, oh gosh, I didn't realize there's so much evidence that makes sense. So yeah, I think it does have to come with the evidence. I think at firstly it's a bit like what, but a lot of these healthcare professionals are actually already prescribing yoga or meditation, and there shouldn't be anything different to that. So there is some receptivity there. Unfortunately, I think it will only work if there is healthcare and health sector buy-in. That's for sure. And often the impetus for this comes from conservation organizations like ourselves saying, what's another way that we can get people, to care, change their behavior? But not always. I mean, there have been some leading voices from the healthcare world who have been advocates for nature. So that bridge is dividing. There was a wonderful relationship already over 10 years ago called Healthy Parks, Healthy People. That was a global thing. More and more of that's coming along. So it's going to take time. I think it's a slow burn. We need to meet healthcare professionals where they're at, address their concerns. If you're having somebody taking you on a bird walk and it's a therapeutic bird walk, as a bird guide, you need to stay in your lane. You can't start trying to give therapy. It's a therapeutic experience. It's not therapy. And this is where healthcare professionals might get a bit nervous. So as long as you're looking at those things, the risks, and how to do it in a way that's helpful, then I think there's a lot of potential. I'm not going to give up just yet.
Great. Yeah. So Janet Bloom asks whether there are any plans to bring the Australian Nature Trails app to South Africa. It sounds like a great initiative.
Yeah, well, it's here, actually. The first trail in South Africa is down at Nature's Valley. And Nature's Valley trusts for the potential. So we have two trails going through Nature's Valley. And we've let our local healthcare professionals know that they can also prescribe that, because if you don't have a guide, if you can't afford a guide, it's a wonderful intervention. So yeah, we've got that there, and we're hoping, we are in talks with an organisation in Cape Town. We hope that there might be something there. So you can download the app for free, and there's a few standalone activities or solo activities which anybody can do. But where it goes, but the added value is when we actually have something in place. We have a geolocated thing in a trail, and those audio are linked to the features of the landscape. They're linked to an area where there's high bird diversity or high bird vocalizations, or it's linked to a place with a big tree or a water feature, and then you can pay attention and notice and dip in that way. Yeah.
Ah, that's amazing. What is the name of the app, or how can people find it if they're interested?
It's naturefix.life is the website, naturefix.life. And I believe there's a QR code. You can go to the Apple Store and Google Play, but I think there's a QR code on the website. And there's also a 10-day nature prescription now, which we've just launched, where you can actually follow activities for 10 days in order to benefit your physical and mental well-being. Yeah.
That sounds great. I'm definitely going to take a look. And next time I'm out in Nature's Valley, I'll give it a try.
Awesome.
I'm just looking for, there's still a few questions in there. Hopefully you're happy to stay on just to answer a couple more. Great.
Yep.
Okay, this is a comment, but I just thought I'd mention it from Glenda, saying a comment rather than a question. The connection between mental health and nature reminded me of the Japanese concept of forest bathing, which is meditation on and in a treed environment. And that just sounds so lovely, forest bathing. I don't know if you've come across that.
I have, actually, and I've also got a little diploma on the side in that as well. So I'm very familiar with it, yeah. And exactly. And so that meta-analysis I referred to on nature prescriptions, they included a lot of the forest bathing research in that. There was some good research coming out in the early 2000s from the Japanese researchers who were really on it in terms of the impact of forest bathing. They were taking cortisol samples salival samples, doing some biometrics, to really see the impact of that. Shinrin-yoku is actually quite new. People often think it's an ancient practice. It actually came out in the 80s. And again, it was Japanese forestry saying, how do we get more people into our forests? But it is based, it does incorporate some of the ancient principles from Shintoism, from Buddhism. So it wasn't a Shinto practice, but it amalgamates that. But yeah, it's kind of faded a bit in Japan, but Korea is really on it now with their version of forest bathing, and it's had government intervention. It's had big state investment because they saw the benefits. And some of you may know that South Korea, I think, it has the highest internet penetration, but it has the most screen addiction. They're having big detox, screen detox stuff happening in Korea now because it's gone that far. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Sure. Carol asks, or she says, as a leadership coach, I would love to study this further. Do you have any training courses, or, where can Carol go to get some more information?
Yes, we are probably having one later this year. We do them from time to time as in-person workshops. We've had a few requests now looking for something that's hybrid or at least online. So feel free to message me in the chat, your email, and of course anybody else, or my email was also on the last slide. I'll just put it in the chat now.
Thanks.
And you're most welcome to contact me there, and I can keep you posted. And that's, yeah, that's been through my work with Kwendalo, but also with NatureFix as well. We work together on those things. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. And if anyone does want to put their email in the chat for Matthew to get in touch with you, I will be sharing the chat feed with him, so he will be able to see them, see all the comments and any requests for contacts as well. So there are a few more questions, but a lot of them kind of cover similar topics that we've covered before. One thing that I'm interested in as well, Warren asks, have you come across sort of boardrooms or corporate businesses using the principles we see in the birding world as a motivation to boost teams and performance or bonding, that kind of thing? How does this kind of relate to the corporate world?
I'd love to see more of it. Yeah. I haven't had much personal contact with that, but I've heard it anecdotally, and my colleagues in Australia had some interest around that as well. Where NatureFix did engage was actually a conservation organisation who had conservation burnout, really. I guess you'd call it compassion burnout. And they, for their whole organisation, asked for a 30-day program, and there were a lot of birding activities involved in that. So it wasn't strictly birding, but we included that in there. And that was, again, to deepen their, many of them were volunteers, to deepen their relationship with place, and to just give themselves permission. The thing is, I think it's an important point, actually, because if it was just about contact with nature, everybody with an outdoor profession should be thriving. I think we often miss that point. And we know that's not the case. So there's something more to it. And, often it's about giving ourselves the permission to slow down, say, actually, that's okay. I need this, to take the time to notice. And so this was the case with this conservation organisation. There was a lot of outdoor work, but they had a burnout. And so I think the same principles, they can and should apply to the corporate space. And in addition to mental well-being for the corporate space, you can also encourage productivity, creativity, cognitive flexibility, as I was mentioning, which birding, has the capacity to do more so than, say, other nature activities. So I think it's a great idea. I'd be happy to talk to any businesses or corporates who are interested, because I think there's a lot of potential there. And again, the social connection, it is fun to do together. And there's the gaming element, the coming together, the sharing the sightings. I've seen it with my students. I've seen it with community groups. I've seen it across the board.
Yeah. As someone who spends time outside as part of my job, I can definitely agree with the fact that it's quite different. I spend a lot of time at De Hoop doing work to try and establish the new penguin breeding colony, and so I'm there quite often, but that's quite different to, you know, on weekends or holidays when I go out specifically birding or just hiking. It's quite a different feeling than, you know, just being outside and working in nature. And I think it's the lack of kind of a to-do list while I'm out in the field. You know, that's what I have to do in the field, whereas, you know, when I'm out for leisure, it's much more free and open.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And as an example of that, I just see that Shashi put an example of David Attenborough. He actually has a sit spot, and one of the powerful practices of nature connection is having a regular anchor point or a regular sit spot practice where you find a point close to home where you can sit on a regular basis a couple of times a week for 20 minutes. Could even be looking out your window, and that is a powerful practice. And David Attenborough has said publicly he does the same thing. Just back to your point, Christina, my wife is a marine mammal scientist, and when she was doing a fieldwork for her PhD, it was always like, okay, go get on the boat, because she's looking for bottlenose dolphins. We had to do our transects, and off we went, and there was a lot to it. And I was sometimes her research assistant, and I'd have the camera, and we had to tick the fins, and there was a lot, you know, you had the costly exercises, you had to get it right. And yeah, very different. And then I remember one day in February, we got the data we had. We finished the transect, the boat engine went off, and we just stayed there. And we had, you know, dolphins around the boat. It was mating season. And that's such a powerful memory for me, such a powerful experience where time didn't matter. And I was like, oh, okay, this is why we do what we do. You know, this is why we're monitoring the dolphins, because it's very, very different from, you know, keeping the set speed on the transect and off you're going to stopping and just listening to the sounds. And yeah, I mean, we need more of those moments.
Yeah, absolutely. What a beautiful experience. And I'm glad you got to enjoy it. I think we will leave it there. There are still quite a few questions, but I'm cognizant of not taking up too much of everyone's time this evening. But I think we could listen to you talk and share stories for the rest of the evening. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and all this amazing information with us. And you can see all the reactions coming in that people have thoroughly enjoyed this. And as I said, I will share the chat feed with you. And there are some more lovely comments there for you. So yeah, I don't know if you have any last words before we close out.
Well, just thank you very much for the opportunity, and I just really appreciate the engagement. Thank you, everybody, for staying to the end, and I really appreciate the shows of gratitude coming up there and the wonderful questions. And yeah, I guess I'll just, you know, if there's anything I can hope for is just to take your noticing every day, you know, and if there's one practice I can impart, which I often recommend people to help notice, is finding a little nature nudge in your life, finding a nature notification, an alarm or a trigger, whatever name you want. But I use the Haridas, and it's an easy thing to do. And whenever I hear the Haridas, I stop what I'm doing and I take a breath, and it's an invitation to notice. And what that does is that it means that nature's not playing a part-time role at the end of the day on the weekend. It means that I need to be aware throughout the day. And you can find something that you're going to hear 6 to 12 times a day. It could be a taxi horn. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be a bird, but something that's going to bring you back, and then notice. And then you can just play with it. You can ask yourself, what's the last bird sound I heard? What's the quietest bird sound I can hear right now? Can I see any birds? Which way is the wind coming from right now? Which direction am I facing? You know, just play with it. You know, just feel the senses in your body. Is any part of my body part feeling stressed? And the importance of that is that it becomes integrated into the day-to-day life. And I think that's incredibly important, because it's about the noticing. It's about the moment-to-moment noticing. So I'd love people to play with that, and let me know how you go.
That's a wonderful way to turn the hardy-dars, which a lot of people find annoying, into something positive. So thanks for that. I'm definitely going to be implementing that in my own life. Thank you.
And Trevor, you're welcome to take a sunbird. I mean, a sunbird's great. If you can allow a sunbird to knock you out of your mental rut or your rumination or whatever you're focusing on, then take a sunbird. Unfortunately for me, I need the hardy-dar shake-up sometimes. But I'm coming from a country with cockatoos and galahs, and kookaburras. So yeah, I mean, that was part of, I wasn't really into birds, as I said. It was more just textured wallpaper and this backdrop for everything. But it was the South African bird life that really got me interested in birding. So yeah.
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much again. And it just remains for me to remind all of our viewers that we'll be back again in 2 weeks' time for another Conservation Conversations. This time we'll be in Sierra Leone in the Gola Forest, so please do join us for that. And yeah, thanks very much to all our viewers for joining us. And thank you very much, Matthew. That was an amazing and inspiring presentation. So thank you very much, and good night, everyone.
Pleasure. Thank you.